Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is entitled Twice-exceptionality, and our presenter today is Mark Schwingel. Mark is the Gifted and Talented Consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce to you Mark Schwingel. Mark?
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here. We have a lot of ground to cover today, but I do want to say that, given how many people are involved, I want this to be fairly informal, so please feel free to share your questions in the question box and Bonnie will kind of be helping to monitor that and help us make sure that you know what's going on, and I can kind of hopefully give feedback as is needed. So please do share your questions. I'm happy to entertain any and all. I'm actually going to be turning off my camera here just so that I have less noise on my own screen. And you'll notice that I'm actually going to be looking, well, when I have the camera on, I actually have a second computer that I'm going to be looking at. So it probably makes as much sense as anything to turn it off at this point. So I will do that. All right, so first off, thank you for attending today. This is great. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. I think it's a really important conversation for a whole bunch of different reasons. But one of the things I want to talk about before we get even very far here are some of the terms. So when Wisconsin Facets put this out, they talked about dual exceptionalities, giftedness and disability, I think was the subtitle. You'll see that I'm naming this presentation twice exceptionality. And so I wanted to just talk about that a little bit. So what I've found in the literature is that oftentimes we, depending on if we're coming at from the special ed end versus a gifted end, we may use different terms. They're essentially the same thing. In fact, not essentially, I think they are the exact same thing. It's just different terms that are being used. So dual exceptionality is often used in the special ed world, whereas twice exceptionality is something that's been long used in the gifted and talented world. So I just wanted to talk about that. The other thing I don't know if I'm going to talk about this later in one of my slides, but we are now moving away at the DPI from the word disability and using just the word ability or maybe differing ability. Just because we're trying to actually be more inclusive. And so that's a move that's been happening pretty recently at the department, and I wanted you to be aware of that. You may also hear me use the word 2E for twice exceptional. So often in the gifted world, we'll use that kind of acronym 2 and the letter E. So 2E is the same thing. At the DPI, we're constantly worried about issues of educational equity, trying to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our students and that they have access to the right educational resources and rigor that they need. And that includes twice exceptional students. So the work that I'm doing, I work with kind of all things gifted ed, but I also work with our advanced placement programs, and I'm the liaison to our international baccalaureate programs here in the state. And in gifted, there's a whole range of different things that we may see. So we may see people who have a really high IQ in a particular area. We may have students who have a specific gift in a specific academic area, science, math, writing, what have you. We may also have students who are creative, who exhibit leadership, or who are really strong in the visual or performing arts. So there's a lot of different parts to giftedness, and twice exceptional is kind of another flavor of it. I don't know that that's a good way to say it, but it's certainly an interesting topic, and we'll be spending time today talking through that. So before I go too far, hold on. All right, you should be seeing the agenda screen now. It was acting up with me, but here we go. Before we go too far, I want to do a brainstorming activity, and I want to ask you a rhetorical question around giftedness. Then we're going to spend a little time, and very little, but a little time on our administrative rules. So what do the actual rules say around giftedness in the state? Talking about the 5 W's of twice exceptionality or 2E, and then what I'm calling what now, what next, kind of what is the work that we've been doing and what might be some of our next steps, and certainly share some resources with you. But before we go too much farther, in the question box, I would appreciate it if you would add a word or a phrase that comes to mind when you think about dual exceptionality or twice exceptionality. And Bonnie will moderate and kind of tell me what you're saying.
Please feel free to go ahead and type them into the question box. I do have one for you, Mark.
Yeah.
The comment was not always recognized.
Yes.
One other, hard for people to believe.
Yes, I think that's really well said as well. And while people are in the question box, you could actually also help me out by just doing a rating here. I want to get on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being low and 5 being high, where would you rate your understanding of dual or twice exceptionality? So again, just put the number 1 being not very, you don't know a lot about it, or 5 being you're really an expert in this area. I would just like to hear where you're kind of at personally.
So we have some middle of the roads, and we have some people who are like around 4s, and we have some that are like 2s.
Nice, good. Well, hopefully I will try and meet everybody's needs as best as I can throughout this. And you're more than welcome to follow up with me after the fact if you have more specific questions that you want to just share with me personally. One other thing, this rhetorical question regarding giftedness, and I've done this a few different times, and what I do is I ask people, and it's rhetorical, so I'm not expecting a response, but I ask people, if you were asked, are you gifted, would you hesitate before you answered? Would you kind of be like, maybe, maybe not, I'm not sure? And so the reason I ask that is that especially for adults struggle with this, and I think children often struggle with this too. And we are sometimes asking kids to self-identify in terms of what they are. Are you gifted? Do you have a learning disability of some kind, or whatever it may be? We kind of put that on them to help us figure that out. And we should have them help us figure it out, but trying to actually name it sometimes gets problematic. So the reason I bring this point up is that it's even more incumbent upon us as adults to try and actually really dig in and understand what it is that kids can know and are able to do, and how can we best meet their needs. So oftentimes people won't hold up a sign saying, hey, I'm gifted, or I'm 2E, or I have autism spectrum disorder. It's not like it couldn't happen, but often the signs are not that blatant. And so we really need to take caution and try and really dig in and try and understand what it is that these students are about as much as we possibly can. The one other caveat I want to say before we jump to the next slide is that I am not an expert in the special ed world. I will do my best. One of my colleagues at DPI, a newer colleague, a woman named Eva Shaw, is on the special ed team. Eva focuses on things like autism and emotional behavioral disabilities. And she and I work together if need be. If there's a situation where there is a twice exceptional student, we might kind of both, work together to try and figure out how to best meet their needs, because it can be really complicated. So I just want to be really clear that special ed is not my area of expertise. I will do the best I can, and if need be, we'll bring in other people. All right, so this next slide, I'm not going to read it, and I'm not going to force you to read it. It is a bit obnoxious. And this particular slide is what's in our administrative code around gifted education. but it doesn't even include the statutory language. So I'm going to blow right past this and talk about some of the key ideas that are in that slide. One of the key ideas is that all Wisconsin public school districts need a gifted and talented plan. So you'll see GT, by the way, that's just GT or G/T, that's my shorthand for gifted and talented. So all school districts need a gifted and talented plan. All Wisconsin public school districts need a gifted and talented coordinator. So somebody at the district, at least at the district level, needs to be in that role and doing that work on behalf of the students in that school. And so it may be only a portion of their job. Many school districts don't have a full-time gifted and talented coordinator, but they may have somebody that's a portion of his or her position. As part of that gifted and talented plan, in the district, it should have gone through all sorts of approvals. It's approved by the school board, and it should really identify both gifted and talented identification. So what is it that they are going to do to determine if a student is gifted, as well as identifying the programming for that student. So if a student is identified as gifted and talented, what programming, or what does that change? How will their learning experience change at that point? The identification process must also address all 5 potential domains of giftedness and use multiple measures. So what we mean there is that, and I kind of referenced this earlier, there are 5 distinct areas of giftedness. Students with intellectual giftedness, so a really high IQ, students who have a specific academic area in which they're really, really strong gifted, students who are gifted in creativity, students who are gifted in leadership, and students who are gifted in visual and performing arts, so they're really artistic or very musical or what have you. So there's 5 different areas. As a general rule, we often see that students who are intellectually strong and have a really high IQ, they get identified through traditional tests. Students who are strong in specific academic areas often get identified, but those other 3 areas of creativity, leadership, and visual and performing arts don't as much. And that's one of the areas that I'm always trying to focus on, is trying to make sure that school districts are thinking about what is it that they can do to help those students as well. Using multiple measures essentially means that they are actually, they're not basing this all on just one test. So they might be getting referrals from the parents. They might be getting a referral from another teacher and saying, you know, I think we should dig in further here. We should do some more work to try and understand, because I'm seeing some signs here that I think we need to try and better meet this student's needs. So the identification process and tools must be responsive to factors such as race, gender, economic conditions, native language, etc. So oftentimes what we see is students for whom English is a second language may not be identified right off the bat because there's this language barrier. And yet, in many cases, that doesn't mean they're not gifted. It just means we're struggling to try and figure out what's happening. So whenever possible, we want these tools to be really responsive. And part of what's required in this, in our rule, is that we have to provide parents the opportunity to participate in both the identification and programming discussions. That's non-negotiable. So this has to happen, and we want there to be that strong communication between the two. You'll also notice that a few of these talk about the word should, or they talk about must. So should and must in our rules, sometimes should is we want that to happen, but we don't always specifically, we can't point to a spot in the rule that says, oh, well, it absolutely has to happen. In other spots is very clear. So the must is like, yes, this has to happen. That's based on what's in rule. And the bottom one, parents providing the opportunity to participate, that is a must as well. All right. I don't know why, but I'm having a little trouble. There we go, moving slides. So I want to talk to you about this idea called the excellence gap. You've probably heard about things like opportunity gaps or achievement gap. I'm actually not big on the word gap in the first place. I think that kind of leads us down the road of, well, there's some sort of deficit here. But it can be powerful. And one of the things that we've been studying in our federal work is kind of the why of the work that I'm doing. It has to do with a federal grant that we just finished up. It's called a Javits grant. And Javits is for gifted education. We spent time really thinking about this idea of an excellence gap. So essentially, we were calling on districts to say, can you please start to look at your data and say, hey, not only are we worried about those students who may be not performing well on the low end so that they're really behind other students, but how are we doing with students at the higher end? So what's the difference in the proportion of subgroups performing at the highest level of achievement? So I don't want to go into a huge bunch of, I don't want to spend a bunch of time on this, but the general idea is that we have excellence gaps all over the state. And we see those excellence gaps for students who are on free or reduced lunch. So one example there is that if you have 20% of your students on free and reduced lunch, and out of that 20%, only 8% of them are performing at the advanced level, but those students not on free or reduced lunch, 40% of them are, we've got this gap. Or to use a more specific example, for students with differing abilities, there's an excellence gap on the forward mathematics exam of 8%. So 10% of students without disabilities score advanced, whereas 2.5% of students with disabilities are scoring advanced. Now, there's another caveat here, which is students with disabilities doesn't automatically mean those students are twice exceptional, but it kind of gives you a flavor of as to what it is that we're trying to do here. Is we're trying to actually look at these different student groups and saying, how are we doing? What are we doing in our schools? Are we looking at this data? Are we also worried about students not performing to the level in which they should? And that's what's called the excellence gap. So twice exceptional, the what of this work, or what is twice exceptionality? There's a couple of different definitions here, and there's probably a whole bunch more. The National Association for Gifted Children put out a position paper called What is Giftedness? And I'm linking that at the, I believe I linked that at the end of this PowerPoint. But they're essentially saying twice exceptional are some students who are gifted and talented may also have a disability or mental health diagnosis in one or more domains. For example, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, dysgraphia, or autism spectrum disorder. So essentially what we're seeing is a student has an identified disability based on our IDEA requirements, but they also have some strength in some specific area. And so it's really difficult, and that's why it's called twice exceptional. It's kind of exceptional on both ends. There's struggle on both ends, and we'll talk about that more. The second definition is coming from an organization out of the University of Iowa called the Bell and Blank Center. And Bell and Blank said it's having exceptional academic ability in one or more areas and challenged by a learning/social emotional disability or diagnosed disorder. So there's two things going on here. And like I said earlier, if you have questions, if you want me to slow down, stop, whatever, please do let me know, and I will be happy to try and address those as we go along. So the next key idea here is this idea of the who of this work. There are estimates nationally that students who are both gifted and have a disability range approximately from 180,000 to as high as 360,000 students in America's schools. Now, this was from way back in 2003 and 2006, so this is pretty old data. It was quoted in a more recent article by a woman named Sally Reese, who is big in the gifted world. What we know, though, is that is a really small fraction of the number of students throughout the nation. One of the things that I listen to, one of the podcasts I listen to is one called Mind Matters, and it's about giftedness, and they spend a lot of time on twice exceptionality, and I'll talk more about that and give you a link to that later in the podcast. Later in the PowerPoint as well. But one of the guests that they had on there, someone from the Bell and Blank Center actually referenced some research that was done by Scott Peters from UW-Whitewater, who some of you may know. He's one of our really knowledgeable people about gifted ed and does a lot of work in that area. He found in his research that nationally, the students who are gifted who also have an IEP is about 0.21%. So that's minuscule. we strongly believe that this number is low, and that we need to do a better job of actually trying to figure out what is it that's happening and who are these students and how can we better meet their needs. So another key idea, and not IDEA, but idea. I didn't think of that until right now that we're using that term in two possible ways. The where and the when of this work. So there are twice exceptional students all over the US, of course, and all over the world. But at the local level is where this really matters. So we don't want to think about them just as abstractions, but at the local level, are those students actually getting their needs met? And what I will say is that, as this slide is talking about, the Marlin report is when gifted ed kind of became more of a legal type term, and we were starting to talk about it in the early 70s. This person named Marlin created this report and talked about gifted education. IDEA rules obviously have been around quite some time, but they were both federal initiatives. Both recognized students were individuals with cognitive and academic differences who needed individualized attention, but they remain disconnected. So the idea here is that giftedness was in one world, IDEA was in another world, and everyone thought, oh, well, those don't really belong together. Luckily, in 2004, with the reauthorization of IDEA, there was this recognition, at least, that there are students who are gifted and talented, but may also have a disability or disabilities. So my point of bringing this up is that while this problem of not recognizing these students who are twice exceptional is not new, talking about it and really seeing any research in it is fairly new, and we're still still working to get up to speed in this area and trying to have more research about what is it that we can do to try and meet these needs. And frankly, in some cases, some people don't actually believe that this type of thing exists, that twice exceptionality isn't a real thing. So there's still a lot of work to be done. So this next slide, being twice exceptional may negatively impact gifted identification and opportunity to foster talents as well as psychosocial functioning. So essentially what we're saying here is that twice exceptional students' area of disability can really impact how they test. So what it is that the test is showing may actually be really confusing for whoever is giving that test. The psychologist or the teacher is like, well, he or she is so strong in this area, but then I'm seeing this over here where they're really struggling. And this idea is called masking, where essentially we're seeing the two different areas of exceptionality are masking each other. And it's really difficult for people to understand what's truly going on. And so we'll be talking more about this masking idea as we go along, because I think it's really a critical idea. And it's the biggest kind of barrier, in my opinion, to why it is that we aren't really identifying as many twice exceptional students as I believe we should be. It's really crucial that we get that identification so we can truly meet their needs. And yet it's very difficult.
So Mark, I do have a comment and part of a question for you. Are you ready for that?
You bet.
So the idea of masking is one that plays a very important part. And what we have found is that many students who have disabilities are really underestimated, and that it's hard to convince others of the fact that they have giftedness in certain areas. Has there been a movement at all to include a comment like in IDEA identification procedures by saying, do you see any special strengths specifically that would lead to giftedness?
A great question, and I think the way that was framed is totally right on. We are seeing those same kind of issues. What I will say is that I think that there is a bit of movement in that direction, and this is just anecdotal. I can't point to any research where I'm seeing this, but anecdotally, I'm hearing that there's really been a push in the special ed world to say when we're talking about IEPs, we need to first start talking about what are areas of strength. because that will actually be a really useful starting point. Just in general, is that we need to kind of start from a strength standpoint versus, oh, there's this deficit and he or she is not doing well in this and this and this. It kind of weighs down and kind of clouds the message that these students often do have strengths, and we need to explore and understand and hopefully address those in some way. So I'm hopeful that some of what's happening in the special ed world, where they're having this conversation about really being strength-based and focusing on strengths, will help uncover this a little more. But there's a long way to go. I don't want to be naive and saying, oh, well, we're right on the cusp of having this figured out. I don't think we are. I think we have a long ways to go, because oftentimes we get caught up in this. And I was a teacher. It's been quite a while since I was a teacher, but you get caught up in trying to address where there are areas where they're struggling, and we should do that. We absolutely need to do that, but that can't be the end of the story. And in fact, I think we can do a better job of helping address those students' areas of weakness by also focusing on their areas of strength, and we can kind of help them balance that out. And through that process, in some cases, we may find students who actually have strong gifts in different areas.
And then I do have another question that just popped in, and it says students also need opportunities once they are identified as twice exceptional, just as any other student would.
Absolutely. To me, one of the things I often say is, if all we're doing is putting another label on a student, we shouldn't even bother, frankly, because if nothing changes in terms of what it is that happens in that student's day-to-day classroom experience, then we're really kind of doing a disservice. And in fact, I think we may be actually making things worse, because we're essentially saying to them and to their family, oh, well, we know you have this other thing going on. We're just not really going to do anything about it. So I absolutely am an advocate for, if you're going to put a label of twice exceptional or learning disabled or gifted or whatever it may be, you need to do something about that. And I think there are ways in which to do that. What complicates it a little bit is that special ed rules are pretty specific about what an IEP has to include and those kind of things. There isn't nearly the requirements from the federal government or even from our state government that say, well, what you need to do around gifted ed. So there's a lot of local control, which is both good and bad. In some ways, some of the school districts are doing a fantastic job with this, and some are not. Some are often doing more than what's probably required of them, and that's what we, of course, want to see. And others are probably doing the bare minimum. So this is a struggle. I think what I'm focusing on is trying to make sure people are really aware that twice exceptionality is a thing, and that it's a thing that we need to be continuing to talk about and think about, and really focusing on their strengths, student strengths, so that we can build from them. Because even if they are not quote unquote gifted, don't care. In some ways it doesn't matter. They still probably have some strengths, and we need to use those to the advantage, to our best advantage, so that that student is able to grow and learn to the best of their ability.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have for now.
Sure. So one other thing I would say is that from one of the other podcasts on Mind Matters, the host, Emily Kircher-Morris, talks about this idea that often the assessments that are being used to try and determine whether a student is struggling in an area or has a strength in a certain area, they're generally targeted towards the majority of the population. So they aren't always that good at capturing where a student may in fact be. So I think one of the examples she gave, or her guest gave, was this idea of sometimes a student may be really strong, but if he or she has ADHD, they may be really struggling to be present while they're doing the assessment. And that assessment may in fact give information, but not necessarily the right information. And then that assessment can be used in saying, oh, we already tested him or her, and we don't see that. Well, did we figure out ways in which to try and meet their needs while we were doing this assessment? So it's difficult, and I don't want to ever claim that it isn't difficult to do, but the idea is we're good at discovering deficits. We're not that good at discovering talents, and we need to really do both. A good assessment will do both. And that wasn't my idea, by the way. That was something I had heard from one of the people on her podcast, Megan Foley NIPCON. So the next idea is kind of just reinforcing more whys for this work, why we need to get a better understanding. Some practitioners, like I had kind of referenced earlier, still see the terms deficit and giftedness to be incompatible. So even if you can kind of get over that hurdle and you say, okay, well, this student is twice exceptional, many times things don't necessarily change. So Schultz was talking about there's resistance from educators to enable 2E or twice exceptional students to access advanced level programs. Further noted, the 2E students are admitted to advanced classes, but the teachers still remain reluctant to implement the accommodations needed in order to really help them. So the proof is in the pudding, basically. We need to always figure out ways in which we are going to both do a really good job of trying to identify what is this kid good at, what are their strengths, what are their areas of weakness, and also concurrently be thinking about, okay, so what does that mean? So what do we actually do with that? And how do we kind of push back to make sure that all of the educators that are involved in this student's life can kind of be on the same page? What kind of collaborative work needs to be happening at the school to try and get everybody going and saying, okay, I think sometimes teachers, and I'm sure I've been guilty of this myself, will say, oh, well, I don't want them to feel like they don't understand, and I don't, so you sometimes hold back because you're making decisions for them. I think that can be really common and also really dangerous, that we sometimes need to have them try things, and then we can get a better feel for what it is that's happening, and what their skills are. And sometimes that means they're not always going to do that great. And other times it might be, wow, they really will surprise you. So this is just another why, in my opinion, why we need to get a better understanding, is that we need to really make sure that all people are on board, that twice exceptionality exists, and that we have to actually, really do something around that and try and help that student in the best way possible. So this is something from the Bell and Blank Center. This is another what. This is talking about this idea of masking. They have a whole 50+ page document, and this was just one little graphic representation they had. So what this is showing is what they call the paradox of the strengths and difficulties for a student with an autism spectrum disorder. And what you'll see here is in the white area, or in the middle of this, in case you're colorblind, in the middle of this is kind of the normal bell curve, and what normally people would be, somewhere in that range of the, 3/4 of the way up the bell curve to, a quarter of the way down on the other side. So most of the students will perform in this area. But what they're seeing, at least for some autism spectrum students, is that the area of blue on the left-hand side is they may be struggling with ideas like socialization or appropriate behaviors and that kind of thing. And then on the right-hand side, in the yellow section, they may be really strong in, let's say, math achievement or reading achievement. So this is just part of the reason I bring this up, is this is a really good example of how masking can happen. Is you're like, okay, well, they are performing pretty well in this area, but look at this over here on the left-hand side, and we're seeing such bad behavior, or they're struggling mightily in reading, but they're great in math, or their writing is just, really not up to snuff, but again, they can do X, Y, and Z in this particular subject. So this is just another example of this idea of masking, where the way I view it is kind of both sides of this bell curve kind of cancel out the other, and it makes it really difficult for people to figure out, okay, what's happening here and what do we do about it? And I am the first one to claim that this is not an easy situation to kind of wrap your head around, because all these kids are different. So the idea again is that the giftedness could be masked because they're struggling in particular areas, and their struggle could be masked because they're really strong in other areas, and it's quite a conundrum. So there are other versions of this where they talk about students with specific learning disabilities and that kind of thing, but I think this one is really helpful in terms of just showing specifically what are some of the different ways in which somebody is maybe presenting to the teacher and to the school psychologist and whoever may be involved in that. So what now, what next? So one of the things that I've been doing in my work, and a lot of this relates to the Javits grant, federal grant that we had on trying to address that excellence gap idea that I referenced earlier, is we're talking about things like the use of culturally and linguistically responsive practices, the use of equitable multi-level systems of support. So you'll hear me say EMLSS. Sometimes it's just a shortened version of equitable multi-level systems of support. Uh, for and we're focusing on gifted education writ large, things like differentiation, how do we engage families better, what lessons have we been learning? So I want to talk just a little bit more about the EMLSS. I even struggle with this. So equitable multi-level systems of support. We work with the Wisconsin RTI Center, Response to Intervention Center, and they've done a lot of work, obviously, in trying to address the needs of students with disabilities, and that's fantastic. I'm actually part of their steering committee because we have been and we are continuing to try and think about how does their work really fit the work that we can do to try and help kids who are on the higher end or that are twice exceptional or whatever it might be. How do we actually do it? So one of the things that the EMLSS focuses on is trying to provide equitable services, practices, and resources to every learner. The focus is on high quality instruction, on strategic use of data, and collaboration with trying to have a continuum support. So the idea here is that we actually need to first do some sort of screening to kind of figure out where are these kids at. And in some cases, if a student is really, doing really well, particularly high in an area or really poorly in a different area, we need to dig deeper. And that may mean more assessments, more screening, or it may be, as simple as, reaching out to the family members and to other teachers and saying, what are you seeing or what did you see? I can't really understand what's happening here. But we want to dig deeper and really get a better understanding of the student and potentially identify him or her as twice exceptional if that hasn't already happened. And then from there, you start saying, okay, where do we put the supports? Where do we match supports to actually meet this student's needs? And how does collaboration with families and with other educators fit in? And how do we make sure that they're getting high quality instruction? And in some cases, in the area of giftedness, you may want to actually swap out what it is that he or she is getting for an assignment because they got that concept and we want to actually give them something new or different and try and help them grow. Or on the disability side, maybe there are things where you have to swap things out because they're not ready to handle that particular assignment that normally is happening for all the other peers in their classroom. So we have to work through things like that and try and really, use data to our advantage. Now, data can be both a blessing and a curse. Sometimes it can also mask our understanding, and we can look at a number on a piece of paper and say, oh, well, we know what's going on here. I think that can be difficult, and part of the reason we push for multiple measures in gifted education is we want to have there be more of a comprehensive look, kind of looking at this student from different angles and trying to see what it is that is happening. The other thing, and I keep hammering this point home, and I will continue to, is one of the biggest things in my mind that we need to do as an education field is have more collaboration, both internally, both with teachers from the previous grade, teachers who are also working in that same school, and try and get a better sense as to what it is that we do for that student. In addition, we need to collaborate with families as much as we possibly can. They are the first teacher of the student. They are the person who actually often knows that student better than anybody, and we need to get their feedback in order to really do the best job of trying to address that student's needs. So that's something that's really required for the gifted ed world. So we do require them to have parental involvement, and I would expand that to say family involvement when you're talking about identifying a student or when you're talking about actually programming for that student. But to me, we should be doing this anyway. Gifted, not gifted, this is part of the work. And so I always push that pretty heavily because I really do believe that that's one of the areas in which we can really make some progress and try and better address the needs of our students. So another what now, what next, I want to talk about this idea of education forward. You may have already heard about this, but if not, I would be remiss if I didn't share what was happening. So when COVID-19 came down and schools were closing left and right, one of the requirements for the DPI was to come up with essentially a plan of what it is that we can do in the fall. And so that we spend a lot of time at the DPI, and my team in particular spent a ton of time really thinking about what is it that we can do to try and address the needs of all students. And also we spent some specific time talking about the needs of special ed students, or students with disabilities, I should say, students who are English learners, students who have gifts and talents, all of those different things. So this education forward guidance is available on our website, and this link will get you there once you have the PowerPoint. But it's broken down into three main parts where it is that we wanted people to actually, when it first came out in June 22nd, we wanted people to really kind of review what happened in the spring. What do we know? What can we be, is there more data we should be digging into to try and understand what happened and or what didn't happen and what we can do about it? Then there was a prepare section where they were spending time really thinking about, okay, how do we prepare for the fall? And now that school started or about to start almost everywhere, we're in the implementation section. And so it's giving some different ideas about what it is that we think schools should do. So some of the work that we were doing, especially on the review and prepare section, was this idea of bringing together groups of educators or groups and families and whoever to try and come up with the best plans possible. So we hope a lot of that happened in schools across our state. But this guidance isn't a requirement for districts, but we felt like we wanted to put this out to give them a better sense as to what we think may be a good way to approach some of these issues, and hopefully give them another pair of eyes, essentially, to say, hey, we should really be thinking about this in school finance, or here's a health thing that we need to be thinking about in terms of student safety and, in regards to distancing or whatever. So it's really comprehensive. But in the guidance, there's a special ed section that talks about the idea of universal design for learning and the equitable multi-level systems of support that I was just talking about. So in the special ed section, they talk about ensure that the principles of UDL are within an equitable multi-level systems of support are guiding instructional design and decision making. We in all the work that we've been doing, we are absolutely supporting that. That's not just a special ed thing, that's every student thing. So we've been pushing hard for universal design for learning. If you're not that familiar with it, essentially it's trying to come up with different ways to represent information to students to try and really help them kind of better understand the why, the what, and the how of learning. So it's giving students a lot of choices. Maybe one particular student is great hearing something once, another might need to watch it a couple of times. Somebody else may not want to hear it at all. They want to read it. They need to actually read this. So trying to present the information to students in such a way that they can really kind of latch on and understand what it is and help them engage in different ways and help them express it in different ways. So maybe the assignment is set up such that a student could write a paper, or maybe they could record a short video, or maybe they can draw some sort of thing or build something that really represents what it is that they're doing and then talk about it orally. So universal design for learning is something that's been going for quite a while. But we're pushing it more heavily, and certainly our special ed team has been pushing it for a long time at the DPI as well. Equitable multi-level systems of support, again, is something that we think is really critical, is strategic use of data and really thinking about what is it that's happening with these students and how do we match the supports to their needs. So what I like about both UDL and EMLSS is that it really fits in line with the work that we're trying to do. It matches, supports the needs, something we have been pushing for gifted and talented kids for quite some time. And it shows a really good alignment between the special ed world and the gifted world, especially, which could then be helpful for 2E students. Just going to check my notes, see if there was anything else. And again, jump in if you have any particular questions. One other thing I will say about the Education Forward document is some of this is really nuts and bolts. So it probably is targeted mostly to like school administrators or classroom teachers, but I think there's actually a lot in there, and we tried to make it as as easy to understand as possible so that it would make sense for different for all sorts of different readers. And I think ultimately what it's attempting to do is saying, we've got COVID here, what can we do to try and best meet the needs of students and try and really help them grow now and also moving forward. So we're pushing some of our initiatives through Education Forward, not just for COVID, but just in general, things that we think are important for the work that needs to happen in our schools. Resources. So this is some of the ones that I've been talking through, some of the different things that I was pulling definitions or whatever that came from some of these different pages or different articles that I have here. So these are just a set of different links. One of the things that was on the NAGC supporting students, supporting twice exceptional students chart is something that I want to really highlight. They have this quote that says, quote, "If there's one thing teachers and parents can do to empower twice exceptional children, it is to help identify and nurture their talents and strengths first. By understanding their own talents, 2E children can build self-confidence, create positive identities, and find like-minded friends. These are the essential elements for coping with their challenges, finding their path in life, and being able to pursue their dreams," unquote. So that, in my mind, fits a lot with what I was talking about earlier too, which is let's focus on strengths to the level possible. It doesn't mean you ignore the deficit. In fact, you really, really should not ignore that. But that can't be the only area of focus. And we can learn so much from their talents or strengths if we kind of put that first. And I think that that's kind of a through line that we're seeing in the education world, is that we really need to be thinking strength-based whenever possible. The Bell and Blank paradox article there is helpful because in section 2 of it, there's a whole bunch of different recommendations for twice exceptional students. They're actionable items that could be that would be worth reviewing. There's all sorts of stuff here. That Bell and Blank paradox article is where I had that chart, the bell curve, that came from that, but there's a whole section just on trying to actually say, okay, now what do we do with that? What if a student is strong in reading, or what if a student is, really strong in math or whatever? How do we build from there? What can we do to try and help him or her? Another resource is what I've been referencing earlier, the Mind Matters podcast. I want to tell you first that I use podcasts as a way to try and get exposed to new ideas. I do not and really cannot endorse this podcast as like the preeminent source for all things gifted, but it certainly has been doing a really, really good job, in my opinion, of finding different experts and bringing them in and having some really powerful conversations about what they do. And one of the things the host, Emily Kircher-Morris, has been doing is she said over this past year, she's been really trying to dig in more on twice exceptionality. And it's an area in which she, having been a gifted teacher, I think, and then she was a counselor as well, is that she understands a lot about giftedness, but this was an area where she's trying to dig in and learn more. And so she's bringing in all sorts of different guests. And they've spent a considerable amount of time looking at twice exceptionality. So those podcasts you can find through that link. They had one particular podcast that you can go to that link and you'll find this one was about how to help 2E students. It was episode 25. One of the other ones that I found fascinating and something I'd never heard of before was this idea of what's called pathological or extreme demand avoidance. These students who have pathological PDA may be twice exceptional. It's not really known for sure, but PDA is more well known in Europe. And so she brought this person who has pathological demand avoidance himself and wrote a book and was talking about that. And it was really, really fascinating. So PDA, it describes those whose main characteristics is to avoid everyday demands and expectations to an extreme extent. The guest on that show, Harry Thompson, had PDA himself, and he talked about how sometimes in school, the student works hard to really fit in or fawn, he uses the word fawn, and and the demand avoidance doesn't show up until they get home. And when they get home, they may not want to go, they may not want to eat, they may not want to go to bed, they may have all these different issues, but in school, it's kind of like night and day, and they're like, what's happening here? So it's really difficult. So his advice for kids is, for kids and for adults, he gives a little advice to both, is that realize that this isn't just about laziness or being obstinate for the sake of being obstinate. It can be a guide through life when you know what it is and what's happening. So he wants people to really kind of think about the fact that this isn't just a behavior issue per se. You can work collaboratively with them to try and determine an acceptable solution. So PDA and autism, as I understand, kind of have overlaps, autism spectrum disorder. But the other thing I would say is that part of the reason this has kind of two different names is that he pushes back against this word pathological, and he thinks the word it should be extreme instead, and many would agree. But it has been called pathological demand avoidance for quite some time. And like I said, we're not hearing about this much here. This is something that I had never ever heard of until I heard this podcast, and I'm trying to learn more about it because, again, I think it's another situation where if we have a better understanding of what's happening here, we're going to be better able to meet the needs of these students. So take a look at those podcasts, see what you think. If you're interested, that's perfectly fine. If you're not, that's perfectly fine as well. But I use it as a way of kind of keeping up to speed with what's, what are some of the more recent conversations that we're having as a field. So some takeaways. In the chat, I put in the chat, but in the question box, I would like it if you would share one or two ideas that resonated with you in this presentation. And you don't have to go into big details, but I'm just curious about kind of what it is that you think actually was interesting, or certainly you can also share if you don't necessarily agree with some of what I said, or if you're confused about that. I'm just interested in some of your thoughts about that. And before you jump in there and do that, I also want to just tell you a couple of takeaways from my standpoint. One is that no twice exceptional students are alike, so we must really teach to the individual and not to the label. So there was a tagline from a different episode of the Mind Matters podcast, and the guest said, quote, "Not all great minds think alike," unquote. And I really loved that. I thought, what an interesting way to put it. The second thing I would say as a takeaway from my standpoint is that the IEP process can actually be really, really helpful in exploring the areas where the student is struggling, but also obviously where there are strengths, and those strengths can then be a lever for change. So the IEP may not always necessarily address the giftedness side of this per se, but it is absolutely an opportunity for a conversation around what it is that's happening and how can we collaborate together with the family and the school and the teachers and administrators and everybody, so that we're having better communication to try and address that student's needs in the best possible way. So so those are a couple of my takeaways, but I would be interested to hear what it is that you were thinking, some of the ideas that struck you, good, bad, or otherwise. So if you could put those in the question box, that would be great. And then Bonnie, if you want to jump in when you see something, I'd be appreciative.
Sorry, we were muted. I was muted over here. One
No
of the
problem.
things that come to light at this point is the fact that many of the students who have been semi-identified as being 2E students are often underestimated. And even though parents would bring some of their ideas to like their IEP meetings, many of them would say, well, let's talk about the disability portion first because we have to remediate that instead of necessarily teaching to the strength as you talk about. Do you have some specific ideas about how to convince some of the people sitting around that table that maybe it might be a lot easier teaching to some of those strengths so that the person is able to handle those disabilities better?
So it's a tough one because I think oftentimes people get into these same modes, especially during like an IEP meeting, and this is how we do it, and this is the first thing that we talk about and how we talk about it. I think interrupting that almost immediately may be a good way to go. And I heard this example from somebody else who, and he may have been a special ed director, but when he started the IP meeting, the first thing he said, he's kind of went around the room and said, okay, let's talk about what, and I'm just using this name, what Joey has for areas of strength. And everybody starts on that foot. So they actually start by talking about those strengths instead of going anywhere down the road of what's an area of deficit, because that can start to uncover and actually sets the tone for the whole meeting where people are kind of thinking about the more positives around that student. The other thing is sometimes maybe reaching out to the who's ever kind of leading the IEP meeting ahead of time and saying, you know, I have some concerns that we're only going to be spending time really thinking about this student's, you know, my child or whoever it may be, the student's areas of weakness, and I really want to do more. I feel like we have to do more. I feel like we're not going to be really having much success if we only focus on those areas. And so what can you do to help facilitate that part of the conversation? And you know, I think just being really explicit with people uh, or saying during the meeting, hey, you know, I really appreciate, I think you're probably right about some of this, some of those different areas of deficit, and there's definitely some work to be done there. But what is it that we can do to really use strengths as our guide, as a lever for these changes? What can we do to try and make sure that this student is really engaged in this work? And that may mean coming up with different tasks or different assignments that help him or her feel more connected to school. And then they can have a much better idea as to whether those strengths are happening. But this reluctance is real. And this, yeah, the word underestimating, I think, is absolutely right. I think oftentimes, and this is true of every kid, I think we often underestimate students. And you know, I think we get into this mode of thinking, well, I know what I see and I get this. And it's like, yeah, but what if that student took an assessment on a particular day and you know, all sorts of craziness was happening at home and mom and dad had a fight, or grandma's sick, or whatever it might be? We really need to take a more holistic look at what's happening with students and really kind of keep coming back and trying to talk with our peers and saying, what are you seeing? And are there ways in which you've been successful with this student? So asking, as a fourth grade teacher, maybe asking the third grade teacher, what worked? Or even the first or second grade teacher, and trying to understand that. I think we have to sometimes be really explicit in saying, you know, I appreciate this conversation around the deficits, and I appreciate that we need to do something around that, but this needs to be more than that. We need to really address his or her needs, and what is it that we're going to do to make sure that they're, you know, the giftedness side of this twice exceptionality is really being addressed and fostered and grown.
Okay, thank you. One other thing, if we are going to try and emphasize college and career ready types of things and community ready kinds of things,
Mhm.
this is more technical than maybe you as not the expert in special ed might be, but as part of the plan, a student would have like a post-secondary transition plan.
Mhm.
What are your some suggestions about how to include some of this twice exceptional type of behaviors and specific qualities in a plan such as that, so people, when the child leaves school, have some ideas of what some of these strengths might be.
That is a tough one, and I'm not super, you know, uh, I'm not super familiar with what some of those transition plans even look like these days because I've been out of the classroom for so long. But what I would say is, to me, if some of these different things are being discovered along the way, so long before it gets to the point where they're about to leave school, then that should naturally become part of that transition plan, and it should really very explicitly identify, you know what, so and so student has some real struggles in blank area but real strengths in this area, and these are some of the ways in which we've tried to you know, address both the areas where they were struggling and the areas where they were really strong. And I think the other thing that's really helpful just in general is trying to make sure that we expose students to as much as we possibly can so that they have a better sense as to what it is that their interests are. And what I mean by that is that they can help lead the way too. We just have to sometimes make sure that they have had the opportunity to really see and understand a lot of different things. So that's a tough one, and I don't think I'm giving you a great answer on that, but it is certainly something that is really strong. College and career readiness, they're building a plan basically from middle school on. And so there's a lot of time to really think through what it is that they may be strong in and think through ways in which to present that information to others.
Okay, thank you. I do have a comment that actually will probably sum up some of the things that you had said. And the comment is, this all was very good. It's a lot of what I've been saying for years, but informally. It is difficult to get real results sometimes testing students. There are times I've tried to highlight my own son's gifts when I was told that there was a denial and that we should shift back to the disabilities. It would be great if we had programs specifically for dual exceptionality. This would give the student a platform for a great life.
Understood.
So I guess that's a great takeaway for you, Mark.
Yeah, it is. It's a difficult takeaway, but I completely agree is that we have to do a better job. If we are really, in the gifted world, we often talk about, I can't remember the exact phrase that they use, but kind of we're losing the geniuses. We're not doing a good job of actually fostering what it is that we should be thinking about and trying to help these kids and growing the next generation of our creative types who are going to build the next Google or the next, whatever it may be. So we have a requirement, I think, as educators to try and do a better job with this. And programming is huge, but I think a mind shift is the first step. We actually have to have people really understand and realize what's going on here in order to truly benefit that student to the best of his or her ability.
Well, Mark, that's all the questions and comments I have for you. If you have a final statement you'd like to make, we're just about over time here.
I just appreciate everyone joining today. I think this is great, and I'm more than happy. I didn't add this to the slide, and if you want, I can send you a better one, Bonnie, with my email and contact information. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, they can do that. I may also send you a couple of other attachments that you can share as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we really appreciate your webinar today, Mark. I know that I've learned a tremendous amount and you've verified a lot of the things that I also have been feeling for a long time. This concludes our webinar for today. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets has over 80 scheduled trainings and webinars for the year 2020. And please check out our website calendar and register for any of the upcoming trainings that may be coming your way. Please watch it for the short evaluation that will be coming to you after the end of our live presentation today. Thank you again, Mark, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you all.